Yom Tov. Ze hayom asa Hashem nagila v'nismecha b'ay. This pasuk takes on new meaning with each passing year. Yud Tes Kislev was always a day in the Hasidic calendar designated for fortuitous revelations of Hashgacha Pratis, and I believe that just a few minutes ago we saw this tremendous manifestation of what you might call a modern-day miracle. Before I continue, I do want to say it is really special to see such a beautiful group of people come out during these big moments. I heard there was a rainstorm, that's a big moment in Yerushalayim. There was a big public political statement, another big moment. And I do want to say a special thank you to the Shluchim of Chabad Talbiyah, Rabbi and Rebbitzin Cantorman. If you can please put your hands together for them. For all of the tremendous work they do in bringing the spirit and flavor of Hasidus to life here in Yerushalayim, the heart and soul of Am Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael. L'chaim. Just a word about the format. I plan to share with you 3 short segments, a nigun in between, and hopefully throughout this journey we will connect, we will grow together, and please God we will be inspired and leave this room somewhat changed for the better. Let me begin with a joke. There was a fellow who wasn't Jewish who came to see a rabbi, and he tells the rabbi, "Rabbi, I hear that the source of all Jewish wisdom can be found in the Talmud. Please teach me a section of the Talmud." The rabbi says, "Sir, you are endowed with what we call in Yiddish a goyishe kop," which means the study of Talmud is somewhat removed from your experience. The fellow says, "Rabbi, I insist, please give it a shot." The rabbi says, "Okay, if you insist, here goes." He says, if 2 people fall through a chimney and one person comes out dirty, the other person clean, which of the 2 goes to wash his face? He says, "Well, it's obvious, Rabbi, the one whose face is clean doesn't need to wash his face, the one whose face is dirty does." The rabbi says, "Agoya shekaf." You see, the guy who comes out with his face clean looks at the guy whose face is dirty, thinks he's dirty, goes to wash his face. The guy whose face is dirty looks at the guy whose face is clean, thinks he's clean, doesn't need to wash his face. The fellow says, "Rabbi, one more chance." He says, "Okay, but I'm telling you, it's not going to work." Rabbi says, 2 people come through a chimney, one guy comes out dirty, the other one clean. Who goes to wash his face? The guy with the radiant, aha look on his face says, "Rabbi, it's quite simple. The guy's face is dirty, looks at the guy's face is clean, thinks he's clean, doesn't wash his face. The guy's face is clean, looks at the guy's face is dirty, thinks he's dirty, goes to wash his face." The rabbi says, "Agoya shekaf." The guy whose face is clean looks in the mirror, sees he's clean, he knows he doesn't need to wash his face. The guy whose face is dirty looks in the mirror, sees he's dirty, goes to wash his face. The fellow says, "Rabbi, one more shot. One more chance." The rabbi says, "Okay, here goes. 2 guys come through a chimney, one guy comes out dirty, the other clean. Which goes to wash his face?" The fellow says, "It depends. If they have a mirror, and the guy's face is clean, looks in the mirror, sees he's clean, doesn't wash his face, guy's face looks in the mirror. But if they don't have a mirror, the guy's face is clean, looks at the guy's face is dirty, thinks he's dirty, washes his face, the guy's face." The rabbi looks at him and he says, "Agoya shekaf." Tell me something, sir. If 2 people fall through the same chimney, how does one guy come out with his face dirty and the other with his face clean? But what I'm here to tell you tonight is that in fact, it is possible for 2 people to come through the very same chimney and for one to come out dirty and the other clean. And that is if one of them enters the chimney clean and the other enters already tainted or dirty. In other words, 2 people could undergo the very same life experience and emerge very differently, depending on their perspective before they encountered the identical situation. Similarly, depending on our disposition and worldview, we can observe and analyze the very same data and yet come up with very different, sometimes even opposite conclusions. Please join me on the following thought exercise. Can anyone think of a biblical example where 2 groups of people were tasked with an identical assignment, and upon conclusion, arrive at polar opposite conclusions? Which parsha? Shlach. The Meraglim. 12 men ordered by Moshe to go on a reconnaissance mission into what was then called Canaan, today Eretz Yisrael, to ascertain its strengths and its weaknesses, and come back with their respective analyses. And what happens, friends? You all know the answer. You know the story. Kalev and Yeshua come back and they say, with glowing reports, Ha'aretz asher avarnu ba lasur oisa tova ha'aretz me'oid ma'oid. It is an exceedingly wonderful land. The others morbidly proclaim, Eretz asher avarnu ba lasur oisa eretz oicheles yoshveh. It is a land that devours its inhabitants. What does Kalev respond by saying, Al tiru ki lachmeinu he. It is they who will be devoured by us. Excitingly, rallying the Jewish people, he declares, Alay na'ala, we will ascend. He says double. Rashi says, even if Hashem would command us to build ladders and climb to the heavens, we would do so. The others very soberly respond, Lo inucha la'alois. It is impossible. They are stronger than us, says the Gemara, mimenu or mimenai. Stronger than us, even stronger than him. Even stronger than Hashem, kivyachol. These are words that borderline heresy. Anyone unfamiliar with the story would be left wondering at this point, did these men assess the very same land? Had they traveled through the very same sites? Did they stay at the same hotel? What's going on? The answer lies in two words in the pasuk that says Vayelchu vayavoyu. Says Rashi based on the Gemara Soita Lamed Hey Amid Aleph Ma bi asan lahakish halichasan lebi asan. What is meant by they went? It already said that they returned to compare their going with their coming. Just as their return was with evil intent, so was their departure on the journey with evil intent. Another reference that supports this idea, of course, is the fact that Moshe changes the name of Yehoshua just before this particular mission, from Hoshea to Yehoshua. Why the name change? In the words of Rashi, Hispalel alav Hashem Yeshiacha me'atzas miraglim. May God protect you from the scheme of the spies. Clearly, 10 of the 12 Meraglim were negatively biased against the mission to conquer and settle Eretz Yisrael long before they stepped foot on its holy soil. One group amplified, while the other group conveniently ignored certain frightening facts on the ground. It reminds me of that saying, I made up my mind, don't confuse me with the facts. These were not open-minded researchers, but were men on a mission. One group bent on sabotaging, and the other advancing the very first attempt at mass aliyah, the very first enterprise of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. You see, all 12 men went through the very same chimney, and yet 10 come out dirty. The other 2 emerge clean. And this is because 10 of them already entered that land somewhat tainted and negatively predisposed, while the other emerged positively predisposed. Let me share with you a beautiful story. During a chidus, a private audience with the Rebbe, the bureau chief of a national Jewish newspaper named Charlie Roth extolled his periodical. And this is what he says. There is nothing, Rabbi, we would not report, even if it meant portraying the Jewish community negatively. Because journalism is journalism, and when it comes to honest reporting, you do not protect your brother or your sister. He concluded, our publication is independent and completely objective. The Rebbe responded pointedly, independent perhaps, but objective? There is no such thing. It is humanly impossible to be completely objective. Every person has a bias of some kind. I understand the Rebbe's words to mean that one can write without an agenda, but not without a bias. For it isn't humanly possible not to bring one's personality, one's life experiences, and one's beliefs to bear on their worldview. The question in life, my friends, is this: what are your biases? How are we each programmed to view the world? And it follows then that the overarching area of our focus in life should be to assess and to set or reset our biases. For after all, so much about our attitude to life is colored by the lenses we wear when we view the world around us. To my mind, the greatest contribution of Hasidus in general, and Chabad Hasidus in particular, is what I would refer to as a positivity bias. A positivity bias is reflected in every aspect of the Hasidic worldview, including its views on physical existence, on the human condition, the trajectory of history, through to its approach to adversity, to challenges, and to struggles. And this bias is rooted in the deep-seated belief and insistence that beneath the facade of every aspect of reality, every human being, every Yid, every Jew, every event, every situation, lies a divine purpose, plan, and a spark waiting to be revealed, yearning to be ignited. And tonight I'd like to share with you just a few examples of this positivity bias, which I hope leaves you empowered and enriched in your own lives. I heard this story from the person who heard it from the person with whom it happened. It's as close as I could get. There was a chassid from a different kreis, from a different Hasidic dynasty and court, who couldn't have children, and he went to see his Rebbe, and he asked for a bracha. He asked that his Rebbe daven on his behalf. And his Rebbe did so, and this went on year after year until one year he turns to his Rebbe, he says, "My wife will not let me back into the home until I receive a promise, a havtacha." And he says, "A promise you can only get from the Lubavitcher Rebbe." So even though it required some creativity, he made his way ultimately to 770 one night. He had a yechidus with the Rebbe. And after the Rebbe provided him not just with a bracha, but with a havtacha, the Rebbe asked him, "Tell me, what's going on in your Hasidic world? What was the last Torah? What was the last piece of spiritual inspiration your Rebbe gave?" And he said the following. His Rebbe had had yahrzeit and had made a siyum, and he had quoted that famous Gemara, that afilu poishe Yisrael malei mitzvahs karimai, that even those who are poishe Yisrael, who are intentional sinners, are malei mitzvot kirimon, are filled with mitzvot, good deeds, as a pomegranate is filled with seeds. And he said, my Rebbe asked a good question. It's what we call in Yiddish a eisene kasha, a question made of iron. It's so strong. What's the question? He says, the question is, if the Gemara calls them Poishe Yisrael, sinners of Israel, how could it then turn around and say that they're filled with good deeds like a pomegranate is filled with seeds? This is a oxymoronic, contradictory statement. Says the Rebbe to this chassid, I too have learned the Gemara. I too had a question when I learned the Gemara. Well, my question was the opposite. If the Talmud says about these Jews that they are filled with good deeds as a pomegranate is filled with good seeds, how then can it call them Poishe Yisrael? How could they be deemed, defined as sinners of Israel? And it seems obvious to me that these two different viewpoints of two Gedolei Yisrael had nothing to do with the percentage of mitzvot versus averot performed by those who the Gemara calls Poishe Yisrael. The deeper question at play here seems to be this. Even those who sin have some merit, have some goodness in them. And by the same token, Ein Tzadik Be'ir Shalayechta, even those who are spiritual and have great spiritual integrity, from time to time fall and falter. And so the question is, when you look at said Jew, which of those two defines his core, his essence? Which is intrinsic and which is superimposed? The Rabbi argued it is true that Jewish people sometimes fall short and engage in sin, but the Gemara says, Ein Adam oiver avera ela im kein ichnas boi roshtus. A Jew doesn't sin unless he is hijacked by a moment of spiritual insanity. And so sin is external to the Jews' core. If so, how could the Gemara call them, meaning define them, as Poishei Yisrael? I heard the following story from a shaliach to Budapest, Rabbi Overlander. He said a man once came to see the Rebbe. He was a Jew who was unaffiliated, what you might call secular. And he said to the Rebbe, I feel like a hypocrite every time I come to Shul on Yom Kippur, because this is the only day I come to Shul during the year. And the Rebbe responded by saying to him that the natural place for a Jew is in Shul. Therefore, said the Rebbe, you're not a hypocrite when you go to Shul on Yom Kippur. You're a hypocrite when you don't go to Shul the rest of the year. And here we come to a beautiful vart in Chassidus. We're all familiar with the Gemara that says, Mitoich shaloi lishma balishma, which teaches us to do the right thing, even if for the wrong reason, because ultimately, balishma, our intentions will align themselves with our righteous behavior. I want to share with you a radical interpretation of Chassidus, which adds incredible depth, dramatically changing the meaning of this classic Jewish text. Mitoich, the core, and the essence of Shaloi Lishma is Lishma. If you dig deep enough, you will find that beneath the facade of self-interest, of egotism, there is something pure, there is something sincere, there is something good in every single Yid and human being. On a personal note, I must say that one of the most gratifying things about the many trips that I took before getting married, on behalf of Chabad, I traveled to over 50 countries to do what's called Merka Shlichus, to spend holidays or summer engaging with Jews in remote and far-flung parts of the world, was the fact that while I was in yeshiva, everything I'm sharing with you I had studied, but it was abstract, it was an ideal, it was a principle. But it's when I went to Phnom Penh, Cambodia, to Laos, to Hanoi, to Cusco, Peru, making a seder for 900 boisterous Israeli travelers. When I went to see the one Jew in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. When I went to rescue a lost Israeli Jew in an ashram outside of Bali. There is a consistent theme and pattern. This principle of the essential Jewish spark came to life in a way that was empirical, irrefutable. Let me share with you a quick story. One year during the summer, my route happened to be to a place called Turks and Caicos. Ever heard of it? The Bahamas, Freeport, Nassau, and then Bermuda. Listen, friends, someone's got to do it. So I meet this couple in Freeport. He is a very devout, indigenous local. Incidentally, on my first day there, I'm walking through the street as one does, and someone pulls over, he rolls down the window, and he tells me, Shalom Aleichem. I thought I was hallucinating. He says, Ich bin a Bahamian. I am a local Bahamian. I can't usually share that joke in my community. It's lost in translation. Anyhow, we're sitting with this lovely couple, and the fellow leaves in the middle of the meeting, and the woman turns to me and she begins to tear up. She's a Jewish girl from Wales. He's a local, very devout Catholic. And she says, Rabbi, I want you to know, if I could do my life again, I would do it so different. She said, I made a terrible mistake. I thought that love could conquer all, but in fact, it's not true. There are certain differences that cannot be overcome. And one of those differences is faith, is tradition, and is one's identity. She says, my Jewish identity mattered nothing to me. I know nothing. I grew up in Wales, in the boondocks, far from anything Jewish. And she said, but recently, it started to matter. And I started to talk to my children about our heritage. And my husband hears this, and he starts to talk to my children about his heritage. And thus begins this terrible tug of war. And our children are caught in between. Her 9-year-old son was sitting there. If I tell you he did not know who Avraham Avinu is, I am not exaggerating. If I tell you he did not know what an Aleph is, I am not exaggerating. He knew absolutely nothing. Because his mother knew absolutely nothing. He tells me, my parents are fighting over me, but he says, I know who I want to be. He says they could fight until I'm 18, but then I gain independence. I didn't quite understand what he meant. The next day we went to a new home they were building. I put up mezuzot. And while we're walking around, I'm making conversation with the little boy and I ask him, what would you like to be when you get older? He says, I would like to be a film writer, screenwriter, and producer. I said, that's fascinating. Could you tell me, do you have a particular script in mind? He says, I do. I said, please share. He said, the story opens with a child born to Jewish parents, and when the child is 6, 7, or 8 years old, the mother passes away from illness. 2 or 3 years later, the father passes away from illness. And then he is adopted by a very devout Catholic couple. And they begin to teach him their faith, their tradition, and force him to go to church and so on. And he says this child is very unhappy because he knows he's Jewish. And so one day he runs from home. And of course here we talk about all those Hollywood frills and thrills. He's jumping off bridges, he's on boats, he's hanging, he's flying, he's doing all sorts of things. Until finally he shakes his adoptive parents and he ends up in a remote part of the world where he is able to practice his Judaism freely and openly. What a window into a Yiddish neshama. What a window into the power and potency of a Jewish soul. Do we have our keyboardist? At this point I want to invite you to join me as we sing one of the great nigunim, Tzama Lecha Nafshi. And I invite you to close your eyes and to join me as we identify that point in each one of ourselves and reflect on the power of the desire and yearning in every neshama to draw close to Hashem. After the niggun, we'll continue with the second example. It's so please join in. On a bit of a lighter note, they tell the story of Aryeh Sharon, who made his way to the estate of President Bush in Texas. And President Bush wanted to impress upon Aryeh Sharon the vastness of his estate. And so he tells Mr. Sharon, you know, I can get into my car in the morning and drive and continue driving, and I will still not have reached the other end of my estate by nightfall. Says Sharon, I also used to have a car like that. You You know the story of a very wealthy man who built a beautiful estate, beautiful mansion, and he invites all of the townspeople over, including the town nudnik. His name was Leroy. Anyhow, he's busy showing off his beautiful place. Everyone's having drinks and canopies, and it's lovely. And at some point he gets quiet and he invites everyone around the pool and he shows them a 10-foot long man-eating alligator. And he says, I'd like to make a following wager. Anybody who jumps into the pool and manages to vanquish, to overcome this alligator, I will give them $1 million. Before the words are even out of his mouth, there's a splash in the pool. There it is, Leroy, fighting this alligator with every ounce of his being. There's thrashing, there's fighting, it's crazy. It sounds like a very intense battle. A minute or two or three or four later, the lifeless body of this alligator floats to the top. And Leroy begins to climb out of the pool completely drained, completely finished. And as he gets up there, dripping, sopping, the fella says, Leroy, I reckon I owe you $1 million. Leroy says, nah, I don't need the money. He says, Leroy, maybe you want some stock options. He says, nah, I'm not interested. I have to give you something, maybe a Rolex, maybe the newest Mercedes. He says, I'm not interested. He said, then what are you interested in? He said, I want the name of the fool who threw me into the pool. Friends, the basic premise of the Tanya, named Sefer Shel Beinonim, the book for the intermediary, is that the state of tzaddik is actually a gift from heaven and is largely unavailable and inaccessible to the average person. Those are bold words coming from a spiritual visionary who changed the spiritual agenda for the spiritual warrior. And therefore, says the Alter Rebbe, you must devote yourself instead to the task of striving to become a Beinoni. What is the difference between a tzaddik and a Beinoni? He explains that the tzaddik possesses no immoral impulses or inclinations, whereas the Beinoni perpetually struggles with illicit urges and negative character traits. He can't seem to shake anger, or lust, or envy, or discontent. According to the Tanya, the main area of focus for the Beinoni, therefore, is not changing his impulses, but is controlling them. To him we say, you cannot control who comes knocking at your door. You can only control who you let in. You cannot help which thoughts pop into your head. That's not your fight. You can only control whether you allow those thoughts into your mind and you give them the space and the attention to develop into palpable, uncontrollable desires which then manifest in words and actions. So the Beinoni actually is someone whose thoughts, words, and actions are completely righteous. And in this respect, we might call him a behavioral tzaddik. Because at the level of behavior, he and the tzaddik are no different. They are both in complete control and mastery over their thoughts, words, and actions, which are completely aligned with Torah. But when it comes to their inner world, the tzaddik and Beinoni could not be more different. The tzaddik is completely devoid, for he has uprooted any wickedness, and he identifies exclusively with his divine purpose, with his higher soul, his neshama. Whereas the Beinoni, the Beinoni is drawn to all sorts of hedonistic impulses, inclinations. He is ugly, he is crass, he is vulgar on the inside, even though he never allows that vulgarity expression. And here is the first counterintuitive teaching of the Tanya. Whereas conventional spiritual teachings tend to focus on trying to uproot negativity at the source, at the level of impulse and inclination, and seek to eradicate the root of all negative characteristics, like arrogance, like self-interest, like selfishness, greed, and so on and so forth. The Tanya posits that effectuating change on that level is simply not within our reach, and therefore teaches us to shift our focus and energy towards the effort of not allowing those urges any expression. So you can only imagine the state of constant tension that the Beinoni lives in. He's always on guard, he's always closely regulating and controlling his thoughts, his words, and actions to make sure that they are in line with halacha. The Beinoni can never let go of the reins. He can never set his spiritual life to cruise control. Since at any given moment, he might encounter stimuli, maybe sights or sounds or scents, or a conversation, which might tempt him into reacting in thought, word, or deeds in ways that are not in alliance with Torah. Which brings to mind what is, to my mind, perhaps the three most revolutionary words in all of the Tanya, the magnum opus of the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad. These three words communicate, again, to my mind, perhaps the most revolutionary religious teaching I've ever come across. Let me provide you with a bit of background. The Alter Rebbe is in the middle of describing the life frustrations of the Beinoni in day-to-day life, and the fact that the Beinoni sees himself as constantly treading water. He sees himself as running endlessly on a spiritual treadmill. There's lots of motion, but there is very little progress. And of course, the Beinoni is very down about this. He falls into despair. And it is to him and this mindset that the Alter Rebbe addresses the following words. He says, in the chapter of Chav Zayin, Parak Chav Zayin, "V'lochein al yipol leiv adam alav." Therefore, one should not feel depressed, v'lo yera levavai ma'oid, or very troubled at heart. Gam im yihi yakein kol yamav b'milchama zu. Even if you are to be engaged in this battle and tug of war every single day of your life. Why? Ki, and here come those three breathtaking words. Ulai lekach nivra. Perhaps with this you were created, in order to struggle. Ulai lekach nivra. Meaning perhaps your soul entered this world for the sole purpose of struggling each day to master the base urges and hedonistic impulses with which Hashem created you by design. Perhaps it is struggling with imperfection rather than attaining perfection that Hashem desires most, and from which Hashem derives most nachat ruach, most spiritual satisfaction. And thus it is those very illicit thoughts that enter your mind, that come knocking on the door of your mind and heart, that enable you to fulfill God's command in averting your attention from those thoughts, which develop into feelings. I'm reminded of a moving story some of you might know, that the Rebbe once told at a Hasidic gathering on Shavuos about a Jew named Reb David. David was a simple Jew, and he once attended a shiur, a lesson, in which he was taught about the importance of Zeh Keli Va'anveyu, beautifying God, so to speak, by way of beautifying his mitzvot. And David got this crazy idea into his head. He wasn't a man of means. Actually, he was quite poor. But every day, for the next year, when he got home, is this better for everybody? Or is
Put the lights back on.
I want to see everybody.
We're not kissing anybody.
It's very hard to talk in the dark. Beautiful. Vayehi Or. The name of the Alter Rebbe was Shnei Or. So he decided to take a few kopecks, a few rubles, off of his daily earnings and put them into a special account so that after a while they would accrue into something substantial. And just before Sukkot, a few days, perhaps a week, he would make his way over to the etrog vendor and he would buy himself the most beautiful etrog ever. This was his dream. He was so excited about this. And the day comes and he shows up to the etrog vendor, and the etrog vendor, who can size up his customers very well, takes him to the discount section. He says, no discount for me. I'm not looking for a mediocre etrog. Zeh Keli Va'anveyu, Pri-Eitz Hadar. I want to make it beautiful. Take me to the most expensive section, to the platinum, to the premium. He takes him to the section, thinking this guy, it's a mitzvah to be kind to everybody. Anyhow, he shows him around. David's looking around, and David knew a thing or two, and he identifies the etrog, and he says, this is the one. He says, sir, with all due respect, it's very expensive. He says, how much? He tells him the number. without batting an eyelid. David takes out his little bag, counts out the coins he put together, and he says, here it is. I'd like my etrog. He takes the etrog. And he doesn't walk home that day. He dances home that day. You should have seen his face. It was radiating that type of pure light, inner light, of spiritual ecstasy, exhilaration, and exuberance. And all was very well until he stepped through the door of his home, and his wife saw the look on his face. Uh-oh. She said to him, David, what's going on? I never saw you this happy in a long time. Something big must have happened in your life. Tell me. David said, no, it's just a good day. Baruch Hashem. She says, David, tell me. Finally, he tells her what happened, and she goes into a rage. She says, David, how reckless, how irresponsible of you. We're so poor. The children don't have new clothing for Yom Tov, and there you are, stashing away money in this offshore account so you can go ahead and buy yourself a beautiful etrog. Such a misappropriation of priorities, and she's so upset with him that she takes the etrog and she bites off the piton, rendering it instantaneously unfit for use. Now let's shift the camera to David, because this is the key moment. David calmly turns his eyes heavenward and he says, it seems like David was not worthy of such an etrog this year. And here's the punchline of the story. It is said by the Hasidic masters that HaKadosh Baruch Hu did not have as much nachat ruach as he did from this act of self-control, of self-sacrifice, as he had since the time that Avraham Avinu was willing to take his son Yitzchak and offer him on the occasion. There's a story told about another Hasidic master, Rabbi Mordechai Niezich, who longed for a talis katan to be made from a piece of wool in Eretz Yisrael. When he finally procured the wool, he commissioned one of his students, his talmidim, to fashion the talis katan. Unfortunately, in cutting out the opening, the young man folded the cloth one time too many and ended up producing two rather than one hole in the tzitzits. Of course, rendering it unfit for use. With trepidation, he goes over to his Rebbe, Reb Mordechai, and he says, Rebbe, I ruined your talis. How can you forgive me? Reb Mordechai calmly told him, don't get upset, don't fret. He says, but I ruined your talis. I know how long you worked on this, how much you desired a piece of wool from Eretz Yisrael with which to connect to Hashem through the midst of tzitzis. Says Reb Mordechai, it's not ruined. This Talmud said, what do you mean? He said, one hole is for Mordechai to put his head through, and the other is a test to see if Mordechai will lose his temper. And this powerful idea relates to something we read about in the past Parsha. Remember that enigmatic episode where Yaakov encounters this being, who most Mefarshim explain is an angel, the spiritual guardian of Esav, his adversary. And during this encounter, Yaakov is holding on to that angel and he says, bless me, I will not let you go until I am blessed. Says the Malach, what is your name? Yaakov says, my name is Yaakov, and he says, your name will be changed by Hashem into Yisrael. Ki sarisa im Elokim va'im anashim va'tucha, because you have wrestled. The Medrash says that sarisa comes from the word striven or wrestled. You have wrestled with the Almighty, with God, with the angel, and you have wrestled with man, and you have prevailed. And what's amazing about the etymology of the name Yisrael is that it draws heavily on the word sarisa, which means to strive, to struggle, as opposed to the word vatucha, which means to overcome and to emerge victorious. And this is, of course, very curious, because in seeking to commemorate this awesome, historic victory on the part of Yaakov, why is it that Hashem chooses to name him and his future progeny after something that recalls trauma, pain, struggle, uncertainty, insecurity, and vulnerability? Why name his children forever after the wrestlers instead of the victors. But herein lies that counterintuitive teaching of the Tanya, which is that in the Jewish tradition, perfection and sainthood is not the ultimate ideal towards which we are meant to aspire. In the secular world, yes, success is defined by the outcome, by the result. How many deals did you close? How many zeros do you have in your bank account? How much is he or she worth? We tend to ask one another, referring not to their self-worth, but to their net worth. But in the spiritual world, success is defined not by how much you take out, but by how much you put in. In the eyes of heaven, taught the holy Baal Shem Tov, the level of one's spiritual perfection does not determine the level of one's closeness to Hashem. Indeed, the Talmud famously offers the following teaching, that b'makom shebal teshuva omed, ein tzadikim gemurim yecholim la'amod, which means that at the spiritual station that the Baal Teshuva, the man who is constantly struggling with his past, he is constantly feeling urges to revert, to relapse, to return to that visceral, primitive life filled with pleasure, where he can attain even a tzaddik cannot reach. Judaism looks to the Baal Teshuva in awe, with great respect, recognizing as it does that there is not a day, perhaps there is not even a moment, in which he feels spiritual comfort and ease, in which that cognitive dissonance is truly resolved and reconciled. On a bit of a lighter note, they tell the story of the imam, the Protestant minister, and the Buddhist monk getting together, and they tell each other in a moment of intimacy, friends, everyone comes to us to confess, but who do we confess to? And they decided to confess to one another. The imam says to the others, listen, I must admit that sometimes I doubt Allah. Sometimes I have doubts. The Protestant minister says, I have to tell you, friends, sometimes I really don't care about my congregation at all. It's all a game. I pick up my paycheck and that's the whole thing. The Buddhist monk turns to the fellows and he says to them, and my sin is gossip. Boy, I can't wait to get out of this room. And it is this illuminating approach to internal struggle that Hasidus applies as well to external struggles and to challenges and crises. Take the following 5 quick teachings of Hasidus, which interpret and shed light on the inner good and potential that exists even within seemingly negative circumstances and conditions. Take the Hebrew word avak, from the root of the word vaya avek, which means to struggle or wrestle. It's related to the word avuka, which means a torch, which is the source of light. It is those very struggles that produce one's inner light. Take the word, says the Baal Shem Tov, tzara, made famous by the Yiddish tsaris. If you take the letters tzara and you rearrange them, what word do you come out with? Tzohar, a window. Because an obstacle is an opportunity, teaches Hasidus. Take the Hebrew word nisayon, which means a test, and of course connotes weakness, it would seem, and a vice. Hasidus teaches virtue, not vice. Because nisayon comes from the root word nes, which means to elevate. Nes is also a banner, a pride of badge of honor. Nes also is a miracle. Because life is God's gift to us, but what we make of life is our gift back to Hashem. And so when you are tested, says Hasidus, this does not prove your weakness, it proves your strength. It proves you have what it takes. It proves you're ready for the next level. The next teaching, nega, which means affliction. When you rearrange the letters, teach the Mekubalim and the Hasidic teachers, you come out with the word oneg. Affliction often serves as the impetus for great existential bliss and pleasure. Then we have the word zemira. Hasidus teaches that psuke de zimra, zemer, zemira, comes from the word to prune, to weed out the negative, to get rid of the ugly, to shine light where there is darkness. This is a difficult war. It's a difficult task. But when you get it right, you produce zemer, you produce music. Divine music is created through the struggle itself. To quote a contemporary composer, there is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. We're ready for the next niggin and then the final section of tonight's program. We're going to conclude with Simcha, for those of you who are curious and wondering whether or not. You know, Abba Evan used to say that Jews like their clouds without silver linings. Friends, did you know that Hawaiians have 65 words alone for describing fishing nets? 108 words for sweet potato. This is no joke, this is real. 42 for sugarcane, 47 for bananas, all staples of the Hawaiian diet. In other words, you can tell quite a bit about a culture by analyzing the prominence and preponderance of words which fall within their language. According to an author named Adam Jacot de Bernard, who spent 5 years researching 700 dictionaries from around the world, this is a quote: "A country's dictionary says more about its culture than does its guidebook." So quite telling about Judaism, of course, is the fact that there are so many words in Lashon Kodesh which describe different shades and variations of joy. Let's come up with some examples. Friends, help me out here. Simcha, Ditza, Rina, Chedva, Sason, Gila. Beautiful. Sheva Brachas, Mazel Tov. Each one of these words describes a different state, a different nuance of joy. Gila comes from the word gal, which means a wave. Describes that transient sensation of being swept up in joy in that moment. Rina is the type of joy related to singing and to shouting. Typically happens when we're in private. But you know what I'm talking about. You're just so overcome and you start to sing to yourself. Ditza is that type of joy that brings out dancing in you. Sason is fascinating because it's a type of joy that's tinged with a bit of sadness. Which is why we use that word under a chuppah. Because of course parents are so happy for their child who found their life partner. But at the same time they're so sad. Because their child is leaving God. Leaving the home empty of their beautiful presence. You can tell a lot about a religion as well from its value system and by the consequences, or what some call punishments and rewards, it ascribes to certain behaviors. In Parshas Kisava we read, Tachas asher le'avadetas Hashem le'kecha b'simcha uvetuv le'vav, because you did not serve Hashem with joy and happiness, gladness of heart, therefore you shall serve your enemies. In other words, Judaism prescribes nothing less than galut, national servitude, and exile for the cardinal sin of unhappiness. So we've established that in Judaism happiness is serious business. But how is it achieved? The Hasidic approach is vastly different to the secular approach. You see, the English word happiness is related to the prefix. Words like happenstance, hapless, haphazard, which imply that happiness is tied to chance. If you're lucky enough to have the right kind of life or the right amount of possessions, you're more likely to be happy, says the marketing world. In Judaism, happiness is not seen as a gift, but as a choice. It is not a verb. Sorry, it is a verb. It is not a noun. Indeed, the Hebrew letters that make up the word sameach, when split into two words, spell out sham moach, which of course teaches that happiness depends on the location of your thoughts. It's your state of mind rather than your state of life circumstance which creates your happiness. This idea is reinforced in the Zohar, one of the foundational texts of Kabbalah, which teaches that the letters of the Hebrew word machshava, when rearranged, spell the Hebrew word for happiness, besimcha. Again, reinforcing the idea that your thoughts, rather than your circumstances, create your happiness. Now, while the idea of joy in Judaism is not a new one, when processed through the lens of Hasidus, it takes on a whole new light. Consider the fact that even before Hasidim were called Hasidim, listen to this, they were called Difrei Lecher, which is Yiddish for the happy ones. And indeed, in 1801, when the founder of Chabad, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, was incarcerated due to libelous information supplied to the Tsarist government by opponents of Hasidim, the very first complaint included in the document they presented the government was that Hasidim were creating a new religion, as evidenced by the fact that, and here I quote that document, in the book of the founders of Hasidism, it is stated that a person has to always be happy. Not only while praying, but at all times. And this idea goes against the Jewish religion. That's a quote. You see, the concept of simcha shel mitzvah, joy associated with mitzvah, was always part and parcel of Jewish teachings. As David HaMelech said, Ivdu es Hashem besimcha. But that simcha was linked to Ivdu es Hashem. Indeed, the 16th century Kabbalist, Rabbi Isaac Luria, the Holy Arizal, once said that everything he achieved spiritually, the fact that the gates of divine wisdom and inspiration were opened to him, was a reward for his observance of mitzvot with limitless joy. Wow! But this joy, as mentioned, was always limited to the study of Torah. Pekudei Hashem yisharim misamchei lev. It's Pekudei Hashem. It's religious exercise, experience, and activity alone that is meant to elicit joy. And that's where joy should remain. When it came to other activities of day-to-day life, not overtly linked to divine service, joy was considered indulgent. It was considered hedonistic. Into this landscape entered the Baal Shem Tov, and he proclaimed in Yiddish, and this is the reference they made in that document, A Yid darf ständig sein besimcha. A Jew must strive to experience joy at all times. But why? On the basis of what? What makes joy holy in and of itself? The Baal Shem Tov drew on the teaching of Pirkei Avos, Kol ma'asecha yehiyu l'shem shamayim. All your actions are potentially linked to shamayim. Whatever a person does, eating, drinking, sleeping, leisure, can all be part of one's divine service, provided that they are done with the proper intentions. As such, if a person is serving Hashem in all of his actions, then David HaMelech's injunction, Ivdu as Hashem b'simcha, applies to all times and to all situations. Furthermore, taught about Shem Tov in Tzava'at Harivash, if you bear in mind that Milo Kala Aretz Kivodo, that the entire earth is full of God's glory, and His Shekhinah is present constantly at your side. You can see the Shekhinah can see you. You will always be joyful. This is a theme that the Alter Rebbe elaborates on in the 33rd chapter of Tanya. And he says, and I quote, "Now, when one contemplates deeply on this matter, his heart will rejoice with this faith. His soul will be gladdened by it to the point of rejoicing and singing with all his heart, soul, and might." And here he shares a beautiful mashal. How great is the joy of a commoner, a lowly person, when he is brought close to a king of flesh and blood who lodges and dwells together with him in his home. How much more, infinitely more, ought we to rejoice in the nearness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Melech Malchei HaMelachim, King of Kings. And nowhere was this revolutionary contribution of Hasidus to joy more evident than in its approach to the concept of Teshuvah, which is typically associated with sadness, with guilt, and with shame. Consider the following remarkable line attributed to the Holy Baal Shem Tov. If tears open up the heavenly gates, joy absolutely abolishes them. Another teaching of the Hasidic Rabbeim, Simcha Poiretz Geder, joy breaks all constrictions and boundaries. Once, during a Yechidus with a Chassid who expressed pessimism, the Rebbe stood up and he walked over to his Sefarim Shafer and he took out a copy of the Zohar and he opened up to the following passage. Ta Chazi, says the Zohar, come and observe. The upper world provides in accordance with the state below, here on earth. If the state here on earth is joyous, then correspondingly abundance flows from above. But if the state below is sadness, then correspondingly the flow of blessing narrows and becomes constricted. Therefore, says the Zohar, serve Hashem with joy, because human joy and optimism draws a correspondingly supernatural joy. On a bit of a lighter note, they tell the story of a terrible economic crisis in Israel. And there was an emergency session in the Knesset. And in the middle of the session, David gets up and he says, I have the perfect solution. Everyone listens. He says, let's go to war with the United States of America. And the place goes berserk. You lost yourself. He said, let me explain. He says, we'll go to war with the United States. We'll lose the war, and then America will do what they always do when they win a war. They'll pour billions of dollars of aid into the highways, into the hospitals, into the government, into the schools, and our economic crisis will be solved. Tzvi stands up in the back. He says, yeah, that's all good if we lose, but what if we win? That's a very Jewish and Israeli joke. Which brings me to my final remarks tonight. The story is told of a chassid whose child became deathly ill and was lying on his deathbed. And this chassid quickly, urgently made his way to the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek of Lubavitch, to receive a bracha. As you can imagine, his fear was palpable. He was terrified of losing his precious son, and with no one else to turn to, he made this arduous journey. When he arrives, he requests a blessing and an audience from the Rebbe for the recovery of his son. And then the Tzemach Tzedek told him 5 Yiddish words, which have since been quoted by all of the Chabad Rabbeim. You must have heard them from your local Chabad Shliach countless times ever since. Those words are Tracht gut, wird sein gut, which means think good and it will be good. The chassid took these words to heart, and as difficult as it was, and we can only imagine how difficult it was, in his shoes on that journey back, he forced out thoughts of negativity, thoughts of pessimism, and instead he introduced thoughts of joy, of light. Imagine his pleasant shock and surprise when by the time he reached home, his son was completely healed and was walking about. At this point, some of you might be thinking, seriously? Tracht, gut, sein, good. All it takes to make things good is to think good? Come on. That sounds like the stuff you'd find in any pop psychology magazine, peddling feel-good platitudes and banal sound bites. Besides, isn't the approach of assuming and visualizing only excellent outcomes dangerous? As it can set you up for great disappointment in the event that those positive outcomes do not materialize. Indeed, recent thinking out there suggests that imagining the worst rather than the best case scenario is the more optimal way to live. Because if you envision and plan for the worst case scenario, you will never be let down. You can only be pleasantly surprised if that best case comes to fruition. Consider the title of a recent article in Newsweek. The tyranny of positive thinking can threaten your health and happiness. It's not a joke. There's a number of very mainstream publications that are running articles with this theme about the negativity of positivity. Or the title of a recent very popular book titled, Stop Smiling, Start Kvetching, a 5-step guide to creative complaining. This book was published by St. Martin's Press. It wasn't a self-published, Lubnik somewhere. This is a very serious piece of work. Reminded me of the story of the person, the waitress going through the restaurant and she's stopping off to ask people, excuse me, is everything all right? Is everything all right? And then she sees 2 Jewish people and she says, is anything all right? And of course, the definition of a Jewish optimist. The Jewish pessimist says to the Jewish optimist, things can't get any worse. The Jewish optimist said, yes, they can. Which brings me to a fascinating point the Rabbi made in an address he gave in 1963, where he expanded on the philosophical and spiritual dynamic behind this principle that seems so simplistic, Tracht gut wird sein gut. He began by asking the obvious question, on the basis of what should one believe that in the face of any challenge, the outcome will be good? Isn't it pretentious and presumptuous to assume that in every given situation, we are always deserving of divine grace, regardless of our state of moral or religious standing? And what of the basic Jewish belief that there is a divine order of reward and punishment that governs our world, making salvation dependent on righteous behavior? And the Rebbe's answer is very profound, very moving. He said, when a Jew decides to place his trust in the Almighty, believing that his current crisis will be resolved favorably despite facing a bleak reality that suggests otherwise, he has in effect risen above his own nature, which in turn elicits reciprocally midah keneged midah, the suspension of the divine nature or order, where only the righteous are deserving of salvation. Hashem, the creator of man, understands how difficult and even supernatural it is for a human being to truly believe. Not to express platitudes, mantras of belief, but to truly believe, to the degree that he or she no longer experiences anxiety and fear. A belief that an unpromising and even seemingly hopeless situation will have a positive outcome. Those who say that faith or religion is the opium of the masses, I think they get it wrong. Because faith is one of the most difficult things a human being can ever do. It's not easy, it's difficult. True faith, of course, we're talking about. The type of faith that allows you to go to sleep even during a day of crisis and hand over the keys to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and saying, you made me, you made this situation, I trust that you can fix it. They tell the story of, in the good old days before technology, the common form of entertainment was tightrope walkers who would make their way from place to place tightrope walking. And there was a great man, he was wonderful, he came to a place and he ties a rope on one tree to another tree. He gets up there and hundreds of townspeople are gathered and begins revving them up. And he says, who here thinks I can make it from this tree to the next? And there's a roaring sound, we do, we do. He does this again and again. Suddenly he takes out a wheelbarrow from between the bushes, the branches, and then he asks the following question. Which one of you is ready to get inside? Silence. True faith is being ready to get inside. And there's no greater expression of that than Tracht gut, wird sein gut. I want to share with you a story that's a little bit harsh, but it has a good ending. It has a personal element to it. A chassid once came to the Rebbe and he says, Rebbe, I would like to ask you for a bracha that an upcoming operation I'm to have should go through successfully. The Rebbe looked him in the eye and he says, you could have asked for a bracha that you'd not need that operation. Yet you chose to ask for a bracha that the operation should be successful. This guy was quick on his feet and he says, Rebbe, I asked for a bracha that I not need to have the operation at all. And the Rebbe said to him, it's too late. I can only work with the level of faith you have before you enter this room. I shared this story with a member of our community who was a very, very unaffiliated Israeli Jewish woman who moved to London. She had a daughter born with a very serious spine issue. Her spine was curved and was very likely she would need to have a very serious operation which could put her life in danger. It was so sensitive. And they had tried putting it off time and again. But finally, the greatest doctors in the world, they're a very, very wealthy family. They went to the top doctors in the world, and the top doctors established a date. They said, if she does not have this operation by this date, you're looking at very serious long-term damage. The operation was meant to happen in New York. She tells me this in passing. I tell her this story because I tell her, I want you to stop off 10 minutes from JFK, and I'd like you to offer a prayer at a holy site, the resting place of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, where miracles are said to happen. And I said, listen to this story so you know what to ask for. Listen to this story so you know what to ask for. Do not ask that the operation should be successful. Ask that she not need an operation. A week later, she called me on operation. They looked at her x-rays and they said, we can't figure this out. But we would currently advise that we put this off until we revisit this in a year or time. Baruch Hashem, I think 6 years later, she hasn't had that operation, and she very likely will not need that operation. It's how we think. So often it's we who limit Hashem's bracha in our life. Let's open ourselves up to those possibilities. Let's internalize Tracht gut wird sein gut. In conclusion, a number of years ago I attended a benefit dinner for the Make-A-Wish Foundation, Israel, which, as it happens, that woman is the president of. She started to do a lot of this wonderful work in London. And we're at this fantastic evening. And the keynote speaker was a man named Dr. Tal Ben Shachar. Has anyone heard of him? Yeah. Mm-hmm. He's considered a happiness guru. Okay, he gave the most popular course in Harvard's history. And during that evening, a moving film was shown in which scene after scene depicting the children's exhilaration upon receiving their lifelong dreams come true before their eyes. And I must admit that at some point a cynical thought crossed my mind. Weren't the large sums of money being spent on these one-off bursts of positive emotion, perhaps excessive, even misspent, instead of paying for these extravagant fantasies of ill children with little chance of survival? Couldn't these monies have been better put to use trying to actually save lives? Secondly, wasn't granting the fantasies of these children, was it even good for them? After all, having received the thing that they wanted most in life, might their life from here onward not be one big letdown? Perhaps an anticlimax? In fact, might these children's lives not be better off without this organization, somehow skewing their sense of reality and exaggerating the realm of possibility, potentially planting seeds of false hope and expectation in these already fragile hearts and minds? After the talk, I approached Tal and I asked him these questions, and he gave me the following illuminating response. He says, believe it or not, we did research into this. He said, I took a group of 60 children, all of them suffering from life-threatening illnesses. 30 of them were in a control group. The other 30 were granted their wishes, and what they observed amazed them. He said the physiological and psychological health of those whose wishes have been granted had improved remarkably. He explained, when we looked at the research, we asked ourselves, how does it work? And he said, we came up with the following idea. We believe that the answer lies in the fact that the gratified participants exercised a different muscle than they had been used to exercising. He calls this muscle the muscle of impossibility. You see, in life we tend to categorize our dreams and our desires into two categories, the possible and the impossible. And as life goes on, the line between those two categories becomes more deeply entrenched and reinforced. So when Michael Jordan walks to the door of a child's home who could only have dreamed of meeting him one day, a major switch occurs in the mind of this child. Something that had previously belonged to the realm of impossible has suddenly proven to be possible. And here's the point. Once one impossibility in their life is proven possible, the lines between possible and impossible become blurred. And the children think, well, why can't the same apply when it comes to the illness that I'm fighting? And it's this paradigm shift that gives these children the strength and the fortitude to get better. My dear friends, there is no people on earth, to my mind, that have exercised the muscle of impossibility more than the Jewish people. So many great historians and philosophers, non-Jewish, even anti-Semitic, came to this realization, from Mark Twain, who called us immortal, to Pascal, to Tolstoy, who called us eternal and invincible. They all agreed on one thing, that the historical parameters that govern every nation on earth simply doesn't exist as it pertains to the Jewish people and their history. All of us here today are a living example of that. And so the next time that life's challenges become overwhelming, and the sense of impossible feels like it's closing in on you, I want you to remember those 5 powerful words, Tracht, Gut, Wird sein, Gut. And the next time that you look at the divisiveness in the world today, and the general turbulence affecting our world, and you think to yourself cynically that only a miracle can right the precarious ship of history we currently inhabit, I want you to remember those powerful words, that a Jew who does not believe in miracles is not a realist. And the next time you tell yourself about a character flaw or an unhealthy addiction in your life, and you say, I do not have what it takes to go on, to continue this struggle, I want you to remember those 3 holy words of the Alter Rebbe in the Tanya, Ulai lakach nivra. Perhaps for this was I created. L'chaim, l'chaim.